Before we get started, I would just like to thank you all for being here, and remind you that we are still working towards opening our Community Mindfulness Center. We're about 80% there, and we're doing a lot of work in the community right now. Tomorrow I'm going to meet with the teens at Willard Library and have candy bars to get them to do some wellness practices with me. And I've been teaching over at the community college as well with the Lifelong Learning Center. So I hope that if you're in a position to help us, that you will. It's a keystone of this community that we're building. Tonight's talk is going to be on the Avatamsava Sutra. And I'm hoping to make that accessible because in its entirety, it's about 1,600 pages, and it is a tremendously long sutra. And I thought I would give a little history of it. This text is said to have begun about 500 years after the Buddha, but it's unique in that it really is likely a compilation of many texts. That some texts were maybe compiled all in one go, like the Lankavatara Sutra. It may be modified over time, but for the most part, it's a clear, concise theme in one text. There's 39 books in the Avatamsava Sutra, and only, I believe, 2 or 3 of them have extant Sanskrit manuscripts, and the rest were probably produced in the 2nd and 3rd century in China. And it was an incredibly powerful and important text for Zen Buddhism, but also for a short period of time, and still somewhat today. There was an entire school of Buddhism dedicated to the Avatamsava Sutra called the Chiezan school. And the main theme, if I could distill down the main theme of this sutra, it is interconnectedness, or interpenetration, or pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. So this Huayan school, their meditation practices focused on meditating on or reflecting on the interconnectedness of everything. And there's so much diversity in this text that I can't really give you much more of an overview because each one goes into different topics. Some of them are incredibly esoteric. This text has been described by some as psychedelic because of the incredible imagery. But there's 2 images that I thought would be helpful in considering this text, if I can remember them. One of them is a classical Zen image of the moon and the dewdrop. It's an image we see in Dogen and we see in early Chinese Buddhism. And the moon represents realization, or it's said to represent realization. And the entirety of that moon is reflected perfectly in the tiniest dewdrop. And no matter how numerous the dewdrops are, the moon is never exhausted. It reflects infinitely, totally, and perfectly. So the Avatamsava Sutra, in parts, helps us begin to look at how it is that Buddha nature can be indistinguished, without characteristics, can't be defined, and yet it constantly manifests without exception in every aspect of phenomena. Without exception, every aspect of phenomena, expressing undisturbed, undifferentiated Buddha nature. So I wanted to talk about just one short book, and it is one of the shorter books of the Avatamsava Sutra, and it's the 10th book, and it's called An Enlightening Being Asks for Clarification, or a Bodhisattva, one with the aspiration to work for the benefit of others and work with others for the benefit of others, asks for clarification. And what I liked about this is which bodhisattva is asking for clarification is Manjushri. And for those of you that have studied Buddhism for a little while, you may recognize Manjushri as one of the key bodhisattva figures. He shows up in numerous sutras and is actually the central figure in any Zen zendo. In a traditional zendo in Japan, you would see this figure, Manjushri, in the very middle of the room, holding the sword of Prajna. And he is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. So there's something humbling about this entire book of the Avatamsava Sutra being dedicated to the profound Bodhisattva Manjushri asking for clarification. I was reading around about this text and this chapter, and somebody said, if you don't have questions, then you must think you know more than Manjushri. And that tickled me. I thought that was kind of funny. And so Manjushri proceeds to ask 10 different bodhisattvas a short series of questions, and as is traditional in Buddha Sutras, everyone responds in verse. And so I thought I would give you a little flavor of the Avatamsava Sutra. This particular translation is by Thomas Cleary. As far as I know, there's only one other full translation of the sutra into English by a monk named Bhikshu Dharmamitra. And I believe that was produced in the late 80s, maybe, as well as Thomas Cleary's version here. So I'll give you a flavor of maybe one of Manjushri's questions, and also a little bit of a flavor of some of these responses. He's asking very, very difficult questions. So Manjushri asks, since the nature of mind is one, what is the reason for seeing the existence of various differences, such as going to good or bad tendencies, having complete or imperfect faculties, differences in birth, beauty and ugliness, pain and pleasure, suffering and happiness? Another question I liked, he asks, all sentient beings equally have 4 gross physical elements. And so this would be earth, water, fire, air. The 4 basic elements that comprise all humans without exception in this context. So all sentient beings equally have 4 gross physical elements with no self and nothing pertaining to self. How come there is the experience of pain and pleasure, beauty and ugliness, internal and external goodness, little sensation and much sensation? So you get this kind of this image of he's asking about, if everything is perfect, undefiled, undiscriminated, why is it that we still experience pain and pleasure, up and down, good and bad, a world that seems hopeful one day and chaotic the next? And so there's all sorts of answers. So one of the answers that he receives from Chief of the Precious is, according to what deeds are done, do the resulting consequences come to be. Yet the doer has no existence. This is the Buddha's teaching. And we could spend our entire time contemplating this because there's a lot there. And it's very easy to get pulled into our first impulse around this. So according to what deeds are done, do the resulting consequences come to be. So this bodhisattva is acknowledging karma. He's saying that based on how causes and conditions express, you have the appearance of results. And yet, no matter how tangible those results are, no matter how heartbreaking or how uplifting they are, the Buddha continues to say there is no doer, and that doer has no existence. The other response I wanted to share with you, I really appreciate it, and I think it's something that, like anything, can be reflected on. And this is his the response from Chief in Riches of Truth. And so Thomas Cleary is kind of known for, instead of giving us the Sanskrit name of the bodhisattvas, it's the bodhisattva of dragon breath wisdom flying upon a cloud, reaching the sun. Because sometimes if you look at his translation of the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra, enormous names for these bodhisattvas. So this is the response of Chief in Riches of Truth. Of all things seen in the world, only mind is the host. So So again, of all the myriad things in the world, only mind is the host. But by grasping forms according to interpretation, it becomes deluded, not true to reality. So he doesn't say that the forms are immaterial, they're not there, they're unreal in a sense that we don't have to pay heed to them. He says it's by grasping at forms according to the interpretation. So we take form and we interpret it and we grasp onto it. And this is the delusion. But he goes on, all philosophies in the world are mental fabrications. There has never been a single doctrine by which one could enter the true essence of things. Chiezan asked me before I came in how I was relating to this, and it's very simply put, it's difficult material. It's very difficult if you try to understand it too much, too literally. Because if you try to understand it too much, all philosophies in the world are mental fabrications. There has never been a single doctrine by which one could enter the true essence of things. And so I simply would like to come back to the title of this chapter, An Enlightening Being Asks for Clarification. It's not enough to say that everything is without self-nature. The Bodhisattva has to continue to ask clarifying questions to penetrate the meaning of what is being said. That even Manjushri, you could say for the benefit of others, but as a great bodhisattva on the path to full awakening, is still asking clarifying questions to understand how it is that there's the appearance of multiplicity and the teaching of non-duality. And the area I've been coming back to, if I can draw this back into an aspect of practice, so it's not just a scholastic exploration of the Avatamsava Sutra, is having to relate to every aspect and every expression of phenomena as an expression of the Dharmakaya, or the undifferentiated ultimate nature. And that includes not just phenomena as it appears outside of ourselves, but the intensity of personalization that arises within ourselves, that we have to be willing to look at, or we're encouraged to look at. We don't have to, but we are encouraged to look at not just the apparent cause and effect, but how everything arising simultaneously doesn't point to one another, but is this full expression of the Buddha's Dharma. And so right now, for some of us, it's more difficult. The world seems really amplified in its negativity. The divisiveness, the warfare, the hatred, the violence, the fear, the anxiety. I've probably heard the word anxiety on the news more times in the last few weeks than it's ever been expressed on the news. All the statistics that come with global anxiety. And Buddhism, as I understand it, in the limited frame I understand it in, it's not the resolution of the relative world. So when we come to Buddhism in times of chaos and in times of difficulty, we should be very considerate if we think that Buddhism is going to provide some sort of palliative, like, oh, what a relief. It might a little bit. But Buddhism says to use the rawness of our experience, particularly as it becomes more and more amplified, to reflect on the nature of this duality that we reinforce through interpreting. To actually use the intensity as an indicator of how solid the positionality is. And it feels like the more intense the polarity, it's usually the more intense the positionality. That polarity is so strong because we are so rooted in a particular belief. And to say that is not enough. That to say that doesn't resolve the tension, it doesn't resolve the negativity. We actually have to be willing to be the negativity, to be the tension, and in as far as we can, not validate any aspect of it. You could just see tension as tension. You might call it the path, that may be helpful, tension as the path, but it may show up that at some point you just have to have the tension. One last line was, real or unreal, false or not false, mundane or transmundane, there is nothing but descriptions. Descriptions are helpful, they help us function. But the Avatamsava Sutra endeavors to bring us deeper into just, beyond just the labeling, beyond just the grasping, and to see what are the positions that are imputed that enable such tension and hatred and warfare and divisiveness. What's been a little bit difficult, the sutra in general is quite overwhelming. It's quite beautiful. I would encourage you, it's really beautifully written, so I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it. But the way I initially started relating to this was not in studying it. I asked Sokuzan that I wanted to start reciting it out loud. And so I just started recording myself reading it. And it's interesting when you do that, or when I do that, I can't register anything I'm reading. When I'm reading out loud, I actually have no idea. I can't follow it intellectually. So that's been interesting. And then it was really curious to find out today that completely unrelated Shokudawa has been doing something similar. But you've been chanting it. And so it's just kind of a interesting coincidence that we both picked up this enormous sutra and started reading it out loud or chanting it out loud. So one last time, I would just like to come back to this. A bodhisattva asks clarifying questions. That if there's something that we feel we've understand or come to a conclusion on, or that we've been able to grasp or digest, a bodhisattva asks for clarification, because it's not enough to just understand intellectually the teachings and the path, but a bodhisattva clarifies the nature. And when a bodhisattva begins to see clearly, a bodhisattva clarifies the nature for the benefit of all beings. Just as Manjushri, who gets to hold the position of honor in the Zendo, and in many sutras, continues to ask clarifying questions for the benefit of others, including these great bodhisattvas who are so generous in responding to his questions. And then, as you might be able to guess, they ask at the very end for Manjushri to actually elucidate based on his insight. So the mutuality is very rich to me, that he asks them questions, they respond, but they also recognize this tremendous bodhisattva and this opportunity for them to then ask the question and give him an opportunity to respond. The last thing, and I'll take a few questions. The Avatamsava Sutra is the flower ornament, flower garland sutra. So that's the English translation, the flower ornament scripture. Any questions this evening, Shoto?
Shoto bowing. Why is I think you even said it was necessary, the clarification. Why is that necessary if all we can really get is more descriptions or philosophies? Bowing.
It's a good question, and I think that's something this text talks to a lot, is teaching to the situation and the individual. And so it's not a demand, it's maybe you don't need to do that. For me, the image of burning something out or exhausting something is very helpful. So prematurely, not saying that's what you're doing, but prematurely it can become nihilism. If it's all just this, then why this? Well, if you'd like to know that answer, then wear it out entirely. And you may find that there are periods of time like me, I'm struggling to come up with questions right now. Occasionally I had some a few weeks ago, and then it kind of just mush, and then a few questions come up. So it's not something to maintain, but I do think there's something to the persistence of exhausting that idea that you're going to come to a conclusion. It's not enough to have a philosophy that you can't come to the conclusion. Thank you. Sokurin.
Sokurin bowing, there was a section that you read that said no doctrine would illuminate the true essence of... Could you repeat that?
There has never been a single doctrine by which one could enter the true essence of things.
Sokurin bowing, what would an example of a doctrine be in that example?
The way I read that is that intellectually there's no perfect elucidation intellectually that's going to be able to substitute for your direct perception. And there's probably more to that, but in this text it talks about there's only one way into this. And it's easy to think that, well, they must mean there's only one right way, there's only one form into this. But I feel like it's something that's being pointed at on a deeper level. It's not saying there's one form or one expression that is the right way into this, but that we see, just like the image of the boat crossing a river, that there's myriad boats, but the boat is not the other shore. And they're just images, and I don't know how far they work for each one of us. And I feel that there's some inspiration here to not settle on an idea and on a doctrine, on a philosophy, that we use these. They're very necessary. We need some sort of vessel, we need some sort of container, some sort of direction. Sokuzan.
Is it possible to observe, look at, receive something without settling? And if so, will one know one has not settled?
Could you ask that again?
No.
I'm not sure.
Sokurin bowing, the one way, the only way, the it seems to come up a lot in texts. Would you go into how you see that only way, that one way showing up for you?
The way that shows up, the only way is the way it shows up. That there's not much that I can do to modify that. And so the persistence or the perseverance that's talked about in Buddhism and in Zen, to just continue to look. But as far as content or concept, I don't know that there's much that we can use other than that encouragement to continue to look. We have to use this body and these senses as they arise as our way to look at what is being pointed at. Yoka.
Yoka bowing. Do the clarifying questions provide more interpretations for clarification?
They may. Yes, they may.
Yoka bowing. Does clarifying necessarily need to include multiple or myriad interpretations?
What is interesting to me, and it's just something to consider, it's just like we talked about in book study today, that the sitting practice of meditation, as Sokuzan teaches it, as I understand it, is not interfered by all the conceptual desire to appropriate the meditation practice. So our desire to clarify concepts and to get further elucidations and to get further knowledge, while it is not what I understand this to be pointing at, it does not inhibit what this is pointing at. And so our path may be, our karma may be, that we have to ask all of these questions. We have to think that we're going to get somewhere with it. So that may be the path quality. So what's important to me is that it doesn't become too prescriptive. How a bodhisattva asks clarifying questions is going to be very unique. And if you think that you can come to a conclusion about how asking clarifying questions will come to some sort of fruition, this is more of the what shows up as the appropriation. Eric?
It's about can you go back to before you said deep penetration? What was the first couple sentences you said there? There was something that grabbed my attention. It was like one of the first sentences you said. It had something to do with deep penetration and attachment.
I apologize, I don't recall.
Okay. I'm sure it'll come back around. My other question was, you said this was transcribed by Timothy Cleary.
Thomas Cleary.
Thomas Clay, thank you. But he said that there were only four elements. Within Japanese culture, Buddhism, there's five elements. There's earth, wind, fire, water, and space. And within Shambhala, there's a sixth, which is deep awareness. Um, so my question was like, with this type of question, how does this relate to space and deep awareness?
Eric, I don't know, and I think it's a valid point, but it's to me missing what Manjushri is asking about. What Manjushri is asking about is that human beings are all created or all expression of the elements, regardless of how many elements you'd like to define those as. This was coming out of Indian and early Chinese heritage. And the question Manjushri is asking is if we are all arising out of these elements, and why is it that we have such different expressions? Why is it that some people have wonderful lives and hard lives? How come there is beautiful and ugly? Why is there this and this and this? So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I would like to maybe offer that as the clarification of what Manjushri was asking the Bodhisattva.
Okay, one last question then.
Just a second,
Okay.
Sokuzan.
Thank you. So when a few moments ago, I asked you a question.
Yes.
And you came back and said, can you repeat that?
Yes.
When I said no, I wasn't being obstinate. I just don't remember anything. So I would like to offer, if you want to finish with Eric here, you can. But I would just like to ask if anybody remembers what I said, recite the question. I really would like to hear your response to that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was when it went to, and if so, I lost the track of.
And if so, can anyone remember what I said? Come on, you super memory people. Nobody? Yanlong.
Go ahead, Shogo.
Shoto going, I think it was something like,
Go ahead.
no, I lost it.
See, a bad memory teacher and bad memory students.
I really, I say something and can you repeat that? I'm not being silly or difficult. I don't remember what I said. Go ahead.
Something to do with settling.
Can you,
I might. Can you help me?
can you observe something without settling, and if you're doing that?
Wait. And if that's where I get, like right now, my brain cannot process both of those.
So let's start with the if statement.
Please.
If you're able to do the thing I'm about to say, would you know?
I didn't even want to give this talk. We could end it right now. I wasn't given a choice.
Are you able to see something, observe something without settling?
And if you,
Would you know it if you were?
I
I can offer that I think that is possible. But what I would like to say, and I don't mean to be obscure or even difficult, I'm just saying that is an area where the identity has an opportunity to just not find anything. So therefore, this doesn't mean that your memory failed you necessarily, but you won't actually know it in the conventional sense. It'll feel more like a not knowing quality, like losing reference points and not really being too paranoid about that. I would like to say that in response to the question. Did I answer my own question? I don't know. We can go back to Eric if you want. It might probably a lot easier.
I don't know about that.
Okay, well, and this is fun. I love bouncing between the three of us and everybody in the room. So I guess my last question is, how far does this teaching kind of go away from the original teachings of the dynamic laws of the universe that Buddha, Bodhidharma, up to Dogen would have? I mean, is there do we believe that, should I be aware of the translation lost between the original Buddhist teachings all the way up to Dogen and up to the traditional Shoto Zen now?
Eric, I appreciate your question, and I would not necessarily agree that anything is lost. if we are looking at this beyond conception while knowing we have to use conception, the expressions have to change. So there is no pristine expression. There is no perfect expression as characteristics, as content, as philosophy, and the sort of discrimination that grasps at the more pure expression and the less pure expression. And this is not just on the refined level of spirituality and religion. This is on the coarse and gross level of negativity and positivity, of right and wrong, that these teachings are inviting us to look at something that is not confined by gross and subtle expression, and yet may be perfectly expounded by gross and subtle expressions. I know that sounds pretty airy, and it is. It's not particularly helpful. It may feel good, sound good, seem workable, but when it comes down to it, as practitioners, it has to be practice. And practice is not particularly accumulation, although there may be aspects of that. I feel the Avatamsava Sutra, for me so far, in the very little bit that I have read, helps work with the desire to maintain reference points, and it points out that not only are the reference points unreal, but they're also completely appropriate and suited to whoever is relating to them. So it's that sort of non-duality that you can't really get a grasp on. Jishin?
Bowing. I don't remember Sokuzan's question, but what came to me after that was the question, how can we directly perceive the question coming from another person? And you just said something about not having reference points. I'm just wondering, is it possible to perceive it and to perceive that question without searching for reference points, and how to do it? Bowing. I know it's your favorite. How to do it is your favorite. Thank you. Bowing.
Be very personal with you for a moment. Like, I have no idea what's going on. My ability to process information has really crumbled in the last few weeks. And I'm not talking about some awakening or something special. It's just, I don't have the capacity to follow where you're going in all these different directions. And so the simplicity of the question is not just for the benefit of others, it's because I literally can't follow the multiplicity, the storyline that accompanies these. And I could tell you, like, if it would be helpful, I could give you like a 3-minute Dharma talk and we could all go away. We wouldn't have to continue this form. For me, for right now, it's that if we are unwilling to sit down and look at these concepts beyond what we think about them in meditation, we will continue to spin with them, and they will become more elaborate, and sometimes they'll feel more refined, which is another elaboration, and they'll feel more clumsy, which is more elaboration, but we never slow down long enough to look at the actual manifestation that is being expressed through phenomena, that all these concepts are being expressed through phenomena that we could look at directly. And the other thing I would say about that, as we begin to look at that, the utter dissatisfaction of having to look at something and see that everything we think about it cannot hit the nail on the head. It's dissatisfying. And yet that's what I'm hoping to do myself. I'm endeavoring to do myself as a practitioner, is to continue to this area where nothing is willing or able to stand still long enough to come to an understanding of it. And so we should ask these questions. I'm not discouraging that by any means. We should ask these questions, but look at how much our question comes along with a demand for a response. That if what Dogen was saying and these Zen masters were saying, the moon and the dewdrop, that the moon is completely luminous in the question. And so we ask about it. But what I'm trying to say is that if the question can be very simple right now, I might be able to respond in a way that may be more direct.
Bowing. I will try to just ask first part of it. Maybe this will simplify.
If you can keep that in your head for just a second, and Sokuzan has something.
Yes, excuse me, Eugene, you can talk in just a minute. I can ask you a very direct question, and I don't mean to be silly, I'm just saying, it's a very, very direct question. Exactly what are you looking at through any of the sense fields, including the mind, at this very moment? What is it?
It's confusion, and knowing or endeavoring to see how that confusion does not resolve into wisdom, but is the perfect expression of wisdom. That's what I'm endeavoring to look at right now.
Okay, and do you see any progress there?
And absolutely not.
Do you see any lack of progress?
Absolutely not.
What do you see?
If I were to say it, I can't say it, but what I see is, it's like this.
Okay, Jishin.
Jishin bowing. I'm trying to avoid the word how after Sokuzan's question. Are we directly perceiving when we just perceiving? Bowing.
Again, I'm not sure if this will be helpful, but I would say it in this way, that you are always directly perceiving, full stop. You're always directly perceiving. What this says is when we grasp according to interpretations, things get murky, but even the interpretations can be perfect expressions of wisdom. And so it's difficult. We're talking about something that makes absolutely no sense because it's without exception, and there always has to be an exception. We always feel like there has to be an exception. And as far as I understand this chapter, there is no exception. So there's only direct perception, but we grasp it and call it direct perception, which is not direct perception. Or we reject it trying to find direct perception. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the positionality as opposed to the expressions. It's like this belief that there will be somebody who perceives directly and there's somebody who does not perceive directly. I get discouraged just listening to myself. Sokuzan.
So
Thank you.
you say, I get discouraged just listening to myself.
Yes.
So is it possible to just listen to yourself without anything particularly arising as far as discouragement or acceptance, rejection, self-complimentary kind of things? Is it possible for that to happen? And if, I'm going to go a little further, hopefully you can remember, and if discouragement arises, do you need to do anything with that?
Thank you. Yes and no. So yes, that is possible. But the discouragement also is the perfect expression of awakening. But we don't get to appropriate the perfect expression of awakening. As soon as we do that, this is what I understand from the text, that is where the polarity, that is where the warfare begins. So our confusion can perfectly express Dharma, perfectly express Buddha nature, but if we try to understand how, that's where we start to try to discriminate again.
How is trying to understand how still the Buddha?
Because it's dependently arisen, it's fundamentally without a self. So every expression of the apparent self, independent origination, is expressing the absolute lack of centrality, of locality.
So you say it doesn't matter what you do?
fundamentally, I would say that as I understand how you've talked about it, that you could say it doesn't matter what you do, but to take that as an attitude prematurely is very much about being somebody who is aloof or indifferent. So yes, it doesn't matter what you do, but we don't have the luxury of taking that attitude because it just further ingrains us in the narcissism of samsara.
Thank you.
Yoga.
Ilka bowing. Earlier you said you were talking about exceptions. What are the exceptions?
I think I was saying that it's without exception. Right now, there is a tremendous, and as long as there's been human beings, there's tremendous amounts of oppression, hatred, violence, abuse, everything. And as I understand the Buddha's Dharma, that any one of those can be our Dharma gate into seeing the absence of self and other. It does not need to validate the expression. It's not like we need to be apathetic or indifferent or trying to justify this happening in this country and this happening in this neighborhood and this happening in this household. But as practitioners, if we are willing, we endeavor to look at simultaneously the relative expression and how we might be able to relate to that in such a way to help us illuminate the nature of phenomena, the nature of dependent origination, the nature of interpenetration as it's talked about in this sutra.
Ilka bowing, this without exception that shows up in neighborhoods and all over. What is that?
Can you say more what you mean? What is that?
Is there anything that, is there a thread in that? That holds it together or that keeps it apart?
I'm not sure if I'm going to respond to your question, so if there's something to clarify around that. When I talk about without exception, is that if something is arising, we as bodhisattvas endeavor to relate to it. It's too late to say, I don't want this to arise, and there's a certain futility in trying to destroy it. So it is arising, we endeavor to relate to it, and the part that some of us are looking at, or all of us are looking at, perhaps, is that it's not an objective situation. It's not us trying to relate to the warfare. It's not us trying to relate to the abuses. It's the abuses arising, our complete disgust, our complete hatred, our complete dissent, and having to have both of those simultaneously to be looked at. That's an aspect of the path that I've talked about recently because there's been so much time for me spent trying to maintain an identity of an observer, an identity of a student, an identity of an objective receiver, a benevolent receiver of the world, rejecting the very confusion that arises here, thinking that the confusion that arises in the apparent external world is the real thing I need to look at. So coming back to that, it's kind of a devastating, or it's a messy, it's very messy. I think that's an appropriate word. It's a very messy situation. So without exception means that if it is arising in consciousness through sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, and mind, we endeavor or we intend to relate to it as directly as possible. Yuhong.
Yuhong bowing. One of the answers you mentioned to Manjushi's question about dependent origination, I think I recall what you read. There's a karmic consequence of the accumulation of the wrong deeds. However, ultimately, there's no door. Could you say more of that? I know that you mentioned, and also teacher SokukoJi mentioned that too, but I still feel like in this context, especially you just mentioned that, could you say more about what does really mean?
I can start by the sutra said, according to what deeds are done, do their resultant consequences come to be, yet the doer has no existence. This is the Buddha's teaching. I think to some extent is what it's saying is that if you put a match to dry grass, it's going to catch on fire. That if you throw a rock at a window, the window is going to break. And it's not to say that we shouldn't endeavor to express kindness, to not continue to perpetuate the abrasiveness or the hatred or the warfare, but you are unlikely to ever refine that to a point where you eliminate all negativity. So, and again, this is more of a classical expression of Buddhism, is that good merit, good karma, accumulating merit, accumulating virtue, that you are told to endeavor to be kind so that you don't in turn receive a bunch of negativity. I don't know if that works in kind of the Abrahamic sense of like a being keeping tally and the retribution coming, but we can't ignore causality. We can't ignore causes and conditions. But it's not enough. We need to see fundamentally that there is no doer and no receiver of that apparent causality. So again, it creates for me a bit of this tension of, okay, so if you're in the relative world, causality is going to occur, but we have to see beyond that to the nature of identity. And to me, this is what Chief of the Precious is endeavoring to explain to Manjushri. It goes on through all sorts of examples, just as in the womb all organs are developed, their substance and features coming from nowhere, so is the nature of actions. There's still action, but the substance is unreal.
It's easier to just to understand if I don't know the past, the past karma, etc. However, I still feel like I'm so challenged and struggle with the fact that I did something bad, for example, yesterday, and today I can see the consequence right away. I still feel like there is a limited delusion of yesterday and today. I still can. There's some say so, I'm doing this. And then you mentioned there's no door. I just feel very confused, like with a short time frame instead of going to the past. Can you say more about it?
I don't know if this is helpful, but I would say you could kind of erase everything I've said. Just kind of forget it in as far as you're able to. And what you're describing to me in a personal sense is to look at the very tension and texture that you're experiencing right now. You don't need to create a framework of understanding, that you don't need to create a philosophy of no self, no doer, to understand that you could work with the rawness of the way it's showing up right now. So maybe it shows up as shame or embarrassment or regret, but even below those labels, there's a certain sensation or there's a certain experience or a rawness that you are looking at or endeavoring to look at, and you could stay with it in its simplest form of that texture. So you don't have to understand it. It doesn't have to make sense. It's showing up in a complete form. It's just not processing on an intellectual level, which is satisfying, that allows you to get off the hook. Like, well, now I can explain it so it's okay and I won't do it again. And I think what I understand, especially with SokukoJi, about going into texture, that you don't really need to go beyond that. In the Sadhana of Mahamudra, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche says phenomena are all the books one needs. So to me, it's similar. You don't need to have a book to tell you what it is. The phenomena is explaining itself perfectly to you in the texture.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Let's close for tonight. I appreciate you all very much. Thank you for being here. I'm coming to you today to ask for your help in bringing together an incredible project, the Community Mindfulness Center. This inclusive space is intended to promote the well-being of our community locally
and abroad, as well as to help us discover a sense of well-being and basic goodness. We are trying to raise $1 million for this state-of-the-art facility, which will provide both spiritual and secular programming. We really hope that you can come together to help us make this dream into a reality.